Over the North Sea, February 17th, 1944. The cold bit through metal and flesh alike. At 23,000 feet, the temperature hovered at 40 degrees below zero, turning breath into ice crystals and sweat into frozen shells against skin. Inside the fuselage of a B-24 Liberator designated Delta Dawn, Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan pressed his face against the waist gun port, scanning the gray void where sea met sky. The bomber, part of the 392nd Bomb Group based at Wendling, Norfolk, had just crossed back over the North Sea after a brutal raid on Brunswick's aircraft factories deep in the heart of Nazi Germany. Smoke still rose from the target area, 300 miles behind them, but the mission was far from over. At 1420 hours, as Delta Dawn labored homeward in formation, the first shadow appeared, a Focke-Wulf FWS 190, a sleek and predatory, peeling out of the sun like a hawk diving on wounded prey. Then another, then 6 more. The Luftwaffe had come to finish what the flak batteries over Brunswick had started. Within seconds, the air erupted with tracer fire, cannon shells, and the metallic scream of engines pushed to their limits. Delta Dawn shuddered as 20-millimeter rounds punched through her aluminum skin, tearing apart hydraulic lines, fuel tanks, and the thin barrier between life and death. The No. 3 engine exploded in flames. The tail gunner's voice cut off mid-sentence over the intercom, and still, the German fighters kept coming. To understand what happened next, one must first understand what it meant to fly a heavy bomber over Europe in 1944, when the skies belonged to whoever could endure the most punishment. The combined bomber offensive, launched by the United States Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force, aimed to destroy Nazi Germany's industrial capacity and break the will of its military machine. American strategy focused on daylight precision bombing, targeting factories, refineries, and transportation networks with formations of 4-engine bombers protected by fighter escorts. But in early 1944, those escorts could not yet reach deep into Germany. Bombers flew alone through the most heavily defended airspace in human history, facing not only fighter interceptors, but also concentrated anti-aircraft artillery that could fill entire sections of sky with exploding steel. The consolidated B-24 Liberator, though less famous than the B-17 Flying Fortress, carried a heavier bomb load and flew faster at higher altitudes. But it was also more fragile. Its Davis wing, thin and efficient, offered less structural redundancy than the Fortress's thicker design. Crews called it the flying coffin when they thought no one was listening. Of the 18,500 B-24s built during the war, more than 4,600 would be lost in combat. The odds of surviving a full tour of 25 missions stood at roughly 1 in 4. Every man who climbed into a Liberator knew these numbers. They wore them like invisible weights. Delta Dawn had already survived 18 missions, 7 more than the statistical average before a bomber was shot down or permanently disabled. Her crew of 10 men, ranging in age from 19 to 26, had become a single organism, each member's survival dependent on the other's precision and nerve. First Lieutenant James McAllister, the pilot from Nebraska, nor flew with a calm that bordered on supernatural, his hands steady even when the world outside dissolved into chaos. Co-pilot Robert Finch handled the throttles and monitored the instruments, calling out altitude and airspeed in a monotone that never wavered. Navigator Paul Renner plotted courses with slide rules and celestial observation, guiding them through clouds and confusion toward coordinates that meant survival. Bombardier Thomas Hale, who had once studied architecture at Yale, now studied the geometry of destruction, aligning crosshairs over factories and rail yards with mathematical detachment. And in the gun positions, nose, top turret, ball turret, waist, and tail, 5 men crouched behind 50-caliber machine guns, their eyes scanning an endless sky for the specks that became killers in seconds. They had trained together and flown together, bled together. They had watched other crews disappear. Some shot down in flames, others simply gone, their bombers disintegrating in mid-air or spiraling into the sea with no parachutes emerging from the wreckage. They had learned not to ask questions when breakfast tables had empty seats. The attack over the North Sea came with the ferocity reserved for crippled prey. The German pilots, veterans of years fighting on the Eastern Front and over the Reich, recognized the signs. The trailing smoke, the asymmetric flight profile, the bomber struggling to maintain altitude and position within the protective formation. Delta Dawn had fallen behind, separated by perhaps 200 yards from the nearest aircraft in the group and in the brutal calculus of aerial combat. Separation meant death. The FW-190s and BF-109s swarmed. Well, they came in from the sun, from below, from the flanks, coordinating their attacks to overwhelm the bomber's defensive fire. Cannon shells, 20mm high-explosive rounds designed to shred aluminum and flesh, struck the fuselage in sequential hammer blows. The No. 4 engine took a direct hit and ceased functioning, its propeller windmilling uselessly in the slipstream. The right wing showed daylight through dozens of holes, some large enough to see through. The hydraulic system failed, meaning the bomb bay doors could not be closed, creating additional drag that slowed the bomber even further. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Eddie Kowalski, reported ammunition running low. The tail position went silent. Later they would discover that Sergeant Frank Delacroix had been killed instantly, and a 20mm round penetrating the tail cone and detonating inside the cramped compartment. What the German pilots expected was predictable and, by 1944, routine. A bomber in this condition, 2 engines out, hydraulics failed, defensive fire weakening, should have done one of 3 things. Attempted an emergency water landing in the North Sea, where survival time in February waters measured in minutes. Broken formation and descended, hoping to reach lower altitudes where the thicker air might allow the remaining engines to function more efficiently. Or simply disintegrated under continued assault, the structural damage reaching a critical threshold where the airframe could no longer withstand the aerodynamic forces. The Luftwaffe pilots had seen all 3 outcomes hundreds of times. They positioned themselves for the final passes, conserving ammunition for the kill shots that would send Delta Dawn into the sea. But something unexpected happened. Delta Dawn did not fall. She did not descend. She did not break apart. Instead, Lieutenant McAllister and his crew did something that defied both logic and physics. They kept her flying. The B-24's 4 Pratt & Whitney R 1830 radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, were designed with redundancy in mind. But losing 2 engines on the same wing created asymmetric thrust that wanted to roll the aircraft into a spiral. McAllister and Finch compensated by applying constant rudder pressure and adjusting the trim tabs, essentially flying the bomber in a controlled skid, using the drag of the open bomb bay doors and the damaged wing to counteract the yawing moment. And it required physical strength. McAllister's leg would cramp from the sustained pressure on the rudder pedal, and Finch had to help him maintain it, both men's legs working the same control. The bombardier and navigator redistributed weight inside the fuselage, moving ammunition cans and equipment toward the left side to help balance the aircraft. The gunners continued firing, not because they could significantly affect the German fighters' tactics, but because defensive fire forced the attackers to break off their run sooner, reducing the precision of their gunnery. Every round fired bought seconds, every second bought distance, and distance meant survival. The German pilots, watching this performance from their cockpits, experienced something between admiration and disbelief. Oberleutnant Klaus Weber, once flying an FW-190 from Jagdgeschwader 1, later wrote in his combat report, "The American bomber was clearly finished. We had destroyed 2 engines and caused severe structural damage. By all expectations, it should have gone down. Yet it continued flying, maintaining altitude through sheer determination. I made 3 more passes, expending my remaining ammunition, and still it flew. I broke off the attack not because I chose to, but because I had nothing left to fire. As I turned back toward base, I watched the Liberator continue westward, trailing smoke but still airborne. I remember thinking, what kind of men refuse to die when death has claimed them?" This refusal to accept the inevitable became the defining characteristic of the American heavy bomber campaign over Europe. It was not simply courage, though courage suffused every moment of these missions. It was something deeper, a fundamental belief in the possibility of survival through effort, a conviction that systems could be improvised, that damage could be managed, that the distance between current position and home base was a problem to be solved rather than a fate to be accepted. This mentality was built into the aircraft themselves. American engineering philosophy emphasized redundancy, repairability, and tolerance for damage. The B-24, for all its vulnerabilities, featured self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb bullet strikes without catastrophic fire, multiple hydraulic and electrical systems that could fail partially without total collapse, and a structural design that distributed stress across the airframe, and allowing sections to be destroyed while others maintained integrity. But beyond the engineering lay the human element. Crews trained to handle emergencies through repetition and simulation, to know their aircraft so intimately that they could diagnose problems by sound and feel, to trust each other absolutely because trust was the only currency that mattered at 23,000 feet over enemy territory. Delta Dawn crossed the English coast at 15:47 hours, nearly 90 minutes after the initial attack began. She had flown over 200 miles on 2 engines with catastrophic damage and through continued harassment by German fighters who eventually broke off as they reached the limits of their fuel range. The formation had long since left her behind, and she flew alone through gathering clouds, guided by Navigator Renner's calculations and the magnetic compass that remained functional despite the electrical system's degradation. When the green fields of Norfolk finally appeared through breaks in the cloud cover, the crew allowed themselves the first full breaths since crossing into German airspace hours earlier. But the ordeal was not finished. Without hydraulics, Delta Dawn had no landing gear, no flaps, and no brakes. McAllister and Finch would have to belly land her, a maneuver that killed crews even under ideal conditions. Wendling's tower cleared all other traffic, and emergency vehicles lined the runway, their crews watching the crippled bomber approach with a mixture of professional readiness and personal dread. The landing, when it came, was both brutal and beautiful. McAllister brought her in as slow as he dared, trading altitude for time, feeling for the stall speed that would drop them from the sky if he miscalculated by even a few knots. The remaining 2 engines screamed at maximum power, then cut to idle as the runway threshold passed beneath them. Delta Dawn settled onto the grass beside the runway. McAllister avoided the concrete, knowing that the friction would cause the aircraft to cartwheel and disintegrate. She hit hard, the fuselage scraping across winter grass and frozen earth, throwing up sprays of mud and debris, the tortured metal screaming as it tore and buckled. The noise was apocalyptic, grinding, screeching, the sound of an aircraft dying. But she slid relatively straight, momentum bleeding off through friction and the drag of her shattered airframe, until finally, after what seemed like an eternity compressed into 15 seconds, she stopped. Silence fell. Then, hatches opened. Men emerged. 9 men, because Frank Delacroix would not be coming home. They dropped to the ground and walked away from the wreckage, their legs unsteady, their faces streaked with oil and hydraulic fluid and the residue of fear. Behind them, Delta Dawn lay broken and finished, her last mission complete. The photograph taken that afternoon, now preserved in the archives of the Imperial War Museum, shows the wreckage in stark detail. The fuselage is punctured by more than 200 holes, some large enough to crawl through. The right wing's trailing edge has been almost entirely shot away, leaving only the main spar and forward section intact. The tail section is barely attached, held by structural members that somehow did not fail, despite loads far exceeding their design limits. Fuel streaked the ground beneath the wreckage, but miraculously, no fire had erupted. The ground crew chief, Master Sergeant Raymond Cole, walked the length of the aircraft after the crew had been debriefed, examining each point of damage. He later told a reporter from Stars and Stripes, "I've been working on aircraft for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like this. This airplane should not have been able to fly. The damage was catastrophic, but she brought them home anyway. That's not luck. That's not chance. That's American engineering and American guts combined into something greater than either one alone." The symbolic weight of this event, one crippled bomber refusing to fall, resonated far beyond Wendling Airfield. By February 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a critical juncture. German industrial production, despite the bombing campaign, remained robust, and Luftwaffe fighter forces had grown more effective at intercepting bomber formations. Losses among American bomber crews had climbed to unsustainable levels. Some missions saw loss rates exceeding 10%. Meaning that statistically, no crew would survive a full tour. Morale wavered. Men went on missions believing they would not return. The psychological burden of sustained combat against such odds crushed even the bravest spirits. But stories like Delta Dawn's survival circulated through the air bases like electricity through a wire, energizing and inspiring. They became proof that survival was possible, that skill and determination could overcome apparently insurmountable odds, that the distance between life and death could be measured in the refusal to surrender to circumstance. For the German pilots who had attacked Delta Dawn, the encounter planted seeds of doubt that would grow in the months to come. If a bomber so thoroughly destroyed could still complete its mission, what did that say about the possibility of stopping the American air campaign? How many rounds would it take? How many attacks? The Luftwaffe faced a cruel mathematics problem. American industrial production was delivering new bombers faster than German fighters could shoot them down, and American training programs were producing replacement crews faster than combat could eliminate them. The B-24 Liberator itself embodied this industrial supremacy, built in 5 different factories spread across the United States, and produced at a rate that peaked at 1 bomber every 63 minutes, assembled by workers who would never see combat, but whose labor determined its outcome as surely as any pilot's skill. By war's end, American factories would produce over 300,000 aircraft of all types, more than Germany, Japan, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined. This was not simply industrial capacity. It was industrial warfare on a scale that redefined the concept of national power. The crew of Delta Dawn returned to combat after a brief rest. They flew their remaining 7 missions in a replacement aircraft, completing their tour in May 1944 without further major incidents. Lieutenant McAllister received the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the entire crew received air medals for their actions over the North Sea. But medals were symbols, and symbols, while important, did not capture the deeper truth. What they had done was demonstrate in the most visceral way possible that American air power was built on a foundation of systems, technological systems that could absorb damage and continue functioning, training systems that prepared men for the unimaginable, logistical systems that ensured replacement aircraft and parts flowed continuously to the front, and human systems that valued the individual life enough to build all the other systems around its preservation. The Germans, for all their tactical brilliance and technical innovation, could not match this systemic approach. They built excellent fighters and trained superb pilots, but they could not replace losses, could not sustain operations, could not match the relentless mathematics of American production. In the final accounting, the air war over Europe was won not by any single mission or battle, but by the accumulation of missions like Delta Dawns, bombers that should have fallen but didn't, crews that should have died but survived, targets that were hit despite desperate defense. The Luftwaffe never stopped fighting, and German fighters continued shooting down American bombers until the last days of the war. But the outcome was determined not by individual combats, but by the larger equation. How many bombers could America send? How much damage could they absorb? How quickly could losses be replaced? The answers to these questions were, respectively, as many as needed, more than the Germans could inflict, and faster than the Germans could kill them. This was the brutal arithmetic of total war, and in Delta Dawn's survival was a single data point in a massive calculation that ended with German cities in ruins and Nazi industry destroyed. The wreckage of Delta Dawn was scrapped in 1945. Her aluminum recycled into new aircraft or peacetime products. Her identity absorbed back into the industrial stream that had created her. But her story persisted, passed from veteran to historian to student, a reminder that wars are fought not only with weapons and courage, but with the systems and beliefs that underpin them. The German pilots who attacked her fought bravely and skillfully, but they fought for a system that could not sustain itself, that consumed resources faster than it could generate them, that treated human beings as expendable components in a machine of conquest. The American crew that flew her fought within a system that, and for all its flaws and contradictions, valued survival, built redundancy, and believed that individual lives mattered enough to engineer aircraft around their preservation. That philosophical difference, reflected in rivets and hydraulic lines and self-sealing fuel tanks, determined the outcome as surely as any battle. The sky over the North Sea where Delta Dawn fought for survival is empty now, marked only by the wind and waves that witnessed that February afternoon 80 years ago. But in that emptiness lives a truth about power and persistence, about the relationship between industrial capacity and human will, about what it means to refuse death when death seems certain. The German fighters that shot at her were not wrong to expect her to fall. They were simply fighting against something larger than one bomber. They were fighting against a system that had decided, at the level of national commitment, that its young men would be given every possible advantage, every redundancy, every backup system that engineering could provide. And when those systems were pushed beyond their limits, when the damage exceeded the design parameters, when logic said the mission was over, the men themselves became the final redundant system, using strength and skill and sheer determination to bridge the gap between the possible and the impossible. That was the lesson Delta Dawn taught the Luftwaffe that day. American air power was not simply about aircraft or weapons or numbers. It was about building a machine, part metal, part human, that refused to stop until its mission was complete. And that machine, once fully mobilized and committed, could not be stopped by individual acts of destruction, no matter how thorough or precise. It could only be stopped by matching its systemic approach, and by 1944, no nation on Earth possessed the capacity to do so.